Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. Today I want to talk to you about the combination of the room and how you work. Because there's that intersection, right? Because the room in combination with the speaker is kind of the main feedback loop, if you will, that tells us everything we need to know about what it is we're doing with the music, right? And our brain is also part of that process. And there's this funny part of this loop of the signal chain, the psychoacoustic aspects of your brain that can really play tricks on you if you're not aware of them. So in this video, I want to go through 3 main mistakes that you're making, that you're unconsciously making most likely, that are keeping you from trusting your room. Actually, there are 4, but the last 2 kind of tie together. So let's get into it. So the first one is that you're constantly changing your monitoring volume, or rather that you are not working at a fixed monitoring volume. And I'm sure you know this if you're one of the people suffering from this. While you're kind of producing, while you're mixing, you're constantly kind of adjusting the volume, and usually the volume just kind of creeps up as you're working hour by hour, and eventually you end up working way louder than you started off at, right? And this is a serious problem that is actually keeping you from making good decisions. And the simple reason is the frequency response of our brain, of our hearing system, right? And it comes down to something called equal loudness contours, or early on called Fletcher-Munson curves. And this is just, as I mentioned, the frequency response of our brain. And the funny thing is that it changes with volume. So at lower volumes, we're way more sensitive to kind of mids, high mids, like somewhere around the 4 kilohertz region. And this is most likely an evolutionary trait because, funnily enough, that's kind of the frequency where most babies cry at, or at which babies cry. And so we're way more sensitive to that. But then at higher volumes, we actually become more sensitive to both bass and high end. And so what that does is that while you're working and you're changing the volume, you're basically messing up the tonal representation, how you are perceiving it. And the best analogy here is just imagine somebody working on film and they're coloring, let's say, the Matrix, right? You know how in the Matrix, whenever Neo's in the Matrix, the film is kind of the scenes, the picture is kind of green, and then when he's in the real world, it's kind of blue. So there's that coloration happening, and there's obviously a person who did that as they were cutting the film, right? Colorizing the film. Now just imagine this person trying to fix and kind of determine what these colors need to be, but during their session, the color calibration of their monitor is constantly changing. Just imagine what impact that has and how debilitating in a way that is to make consistent decisions. And that's the same with volume in the audio world. If you are constantly changing the volume while you work, you're basically changing the tonal calibration of the signal chain that you're listening through. And obviously that makes it very, very difficult to judge the tonality, the balance, how much treble, how much bass you need in your mix, right? So that's the first mistake that you're probably making. And if you are one of those people, see if you can figure out how you can fix the volume while you're mixing. And the 2 things to watch out there are mainly, first of all, that obviously you shouldn't change the volume knob, but you also need to be aware that while your volume knob might be fixed, if the average volume of your mix changes in your DAW, in your project, that is ultimately the same as changing the volume with your volume knob. So you don't just have to fix the volume knob, or you don't just have to fix the volume with your volume knob, but you also have to fix the volume of your mix while you're working. You basically always want to hit the same levels on your mix bus. So those are the 2 things to watch out for concerning fixing the volume. The second unconscious mistake that you might be making is that you're not referencing enough. And you've probably heard people talk about this before. I might have mentioned it before as well. But the point is that while you're working, while you're producing, even while you're mixing, while you're recording, you're not consciously and regularly listening to professional mixes, tracks as references to kind of recalibrate your brain. Okay, and you should really be doing this definitely when you're starting out, probably like pretty much all the time, like every half hour at least. You want to kind of switch back to a reference and just listen to that for a minute or so. That's usually enough. And that will kind of get your brain back on track to where what sounds good, or what songs, what music needs to sound, how music needs to sound on your particular referencing system, on your particular speaker system and in your room. Okay, and the problem that happens when you don't reference it enough is that something that I call taste drift, and it basically comes down to our auditory memory being fairly short. So you can really only remember what something sounded like for very, very short periods of time. We're talking seconds at best. And beyond that, you're basically incapable of accurately remembering what a sound, what kind of character, what detailed character a certain sound had. So what happens is that we as we work, and if we don't kind of bring ourselves back on track with references, because our auditory memory is so short, we can kind of go on these tangents. We can just like drift off into a something that resembles good taste, something that feels good. But when you take a break and you come back and your brain has kind of neutralized itself again, you realize that you were completely off. And you've probably had this before, where you went on like a mixing spree at night and you were kind of mixing away and you were really in the zone and you really had a good time doing it. And then you kind of finished the session early in the early morning and went to bed, and then listened to it again in the next morning, and you're just like, what was I doing? Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. It's this drifting off into a semblance of taste that has almost no semblance with the real world anymore, right? And so that's why we need to bring back our taste. We need to bring back our perception to a reference using other music. Yeah, and the key here, as I made with the point before, is that you need to reference at the same volume. Yeah, because we're so sensitive to it, to volume changes, you need to bring in music into your session, and usually it's obviously finished material, mastered material, so you need to bring it down in volume until it matches your listening level, the level of your mix in your session, and only then can you do a somewhat reliable apples to apples comparison between your mix, your production, your work, and the references that you bring in. Right, so at its core, that is what it's all about. There's a ton we could talk about in terms of how to reference and how to use reference, but at its core, that's the most important. If you're not referencing enough, you need to do it way more frequently, and especially when you're starting out. So the third mistake that you're probably potentially making is that you're not taking enough breaks. And again, this comes down to this whole taste drift thing that I mentioned before. At some point, you might find that your brain is kind of saturated and you're listening to the music and you can't really tell. Sometimes you can literally not tell what changes you're making if you're so deep in the weeds. Oftentimes, it's just that you're making changes and you can kind of hear what changes you're making, but you can't tell whether it's the right thing to do. And at that point, it is absolutely essential to take a break. Again, to neutralize your brain in a way, right? To bring it back to a neutral state where you're once again able to judge what you're listening to somewhat objectively. And for most people, this is probably going to be around once every hour, once every 2 hours, you want to take a break, because you will be kind of saturated. Your brain will be saturated in a way, or you will have gone down this tangent of taste drift too far to be able to make objective decisions. Yeah. So a key indicator of when that's happening, when you need to take a break, is what I just mentioned before, is that you're listening to something, you're making an EQ move, let's say, and you can't tell whether it is the right thing to do or not. At that point, take a break. And even more important, or the most important break, in my opinion, as part of this idea of taking breaks, is an overnight break when you're mixing, for example, right? So I always do a mix session and take it up to the point where I'm kind of happy with the mix on one day. Then I export the track, and then I just stop for the day, and I'll only restart working on it the next day, because sometimes it just takes a long time to get away from the music to be able to kind of make objective decisions again. Yeah? And that really brings me to my fourth point in all of this, and that is that once you've taken that overnight break, it's really important to make the initial decisions or the analysis of what the mix needs outside of the studio. Okay, so it kind of works like this. The first mixing session, the first part of mixing the song is something that you do in the studio. You get it up to a point where you're sort of happy with the mix, or you realize you're kind of saturated and you can't go on. You export the mix, you take an overnight break, but now when you come back to mixing, you don't actually make decisions on what to do inside the studio. You make decisions on what the mix needs outside the studio on a multitude of potential referencing systems. Your car, earphones, headphones, your hi-fi system at home, your friend's hi-fi system, whatever you need to jot down notes on the major points that aren't working in the mix. And now you come back to the studio, and the studio now just becomes a tool to implement those points. At that point, you're not questioning whether the points you wrote down are the thing that actually needs to happen. Now you're just using the studio as a tool to implement those changes, right? So that's the fourth mistake that I think a lot of people make, is that when coming back to the studio after a break, after a long break, sometimes an overnight break, is to use the studio to once again tell you what the mix needs. And in my opinion, there comes a point where you just need to take the mix outside the studio, and from there on out, to just use the studio as a tool to implement what you already know needs to change. Okay, so in summary, those are the 4 main mistakes that I see people making unconsciously when they're using their studio as part of the kind of feedback loop that feeds the decision-making process while you're mixing, while you're producing, while you're recording, right? So it is not fixing the volume, it is not referencing enough, it is not taking enough breaks, and it is using the studio after the break to make decisions instead of just using it as a tool to implement the decisions that you've already made that need changing in the piece of music that we're working on. Okay, cool. So one final note, if you're in the process of treating your home studio, if you're thinking about treating your home studio and you're not exactly sure where to start, what it is you need to focus on at every step of the way, I want you to download my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description. It is my 5 main steps that you need to take to treat your home studio in the sequence that I've laid them out there, in order for you to focus on the right aspect of treatment at the right stage in this process and not end up turning in circles because you forgot to do something at the beginning and then need to go back and make changes. Yeah, I see this happening all the time. I think this is really, really critical to do those steps in the right sequence. And so there's everything in there from placing your setup in the correct location in your room, setting up your speakers. It's when and how to use porous absorption, when to use resonance absorption, setting up subwoofers, where measurements, acoustic measurements, play a part in this process, how you need to use them, how you need to look at them, speaker decoupling, it's all in there. So make sure you download my home studio treatment framework at the link in the description in order for you to figure out how to go about treating your home studio. All right, that's it for now. Let's keep learning to trust our ears and get back to having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.